You're listening to Desert Island Gems, an in-depth and intimate interview where we ask our guests to select meaningful gems that they would take to a desert island if they were cast away alone. We hope that their journey inspires you and helps you reflect. For more information on the show, visit the Radio Ramadan Glasgow webpage and look out for extended versions of the interviews on McMuslim.tv, the new online video channel for Scottish Muslims. So our guest today is Iqbal Nasim, the Chief Executive of the National Zakat Foundation, and we're sitting in the headquarters here in East London. Assalamu alaikum Iqbal, thank you for joining us.
Salam.
So Iqbal, tell us a bit about the National Zakat Foundation.
Sure. So the National Zakat Foundation began in 2011. We're basically a zakat institution for the UK Muslim community, and we have two core aims. Number one is that all zakat that should be being paid in the UK is paid, so that Muslims in this country understand, calculate and pay their zakat properly. And secondly, that we have an exclusive local focus when it comes to the distribution of zakat. So what we're trying to do is revive one of the classical principles of zakat, which is for zakat to be distributed locally, and for the eligible recipients of zakat in this country to receive their dues. Now, the growth of the whole Islamic finance sector over the last few years has been quite massive, particularly in the UK. Do you think this is a heyday for the industry? I'm not sure I can necessarily comment specifically on the Islamic finance industry per se, but I do think that there is a kind of an overlap when we look at the work of the National Zakat Foundation from the perspective, Muslims, in the UK and elsewhere in so-called Western countries are kind of trying to figure out what it means to be Muslim in the kind of context, the time and place that we find ourselves in. And so just as in the financial kind of sector, people are trying to then carve out this niche of Islamic finance, similarly when it comes to something as important, as central as the institution of zakat, our work represents an attempt to have an institution focused on this particular topic that is both authentic but also contextually relevant and doing what we think God wants us to do with this pillar.
And I guess because it is one of the fundamental pillars of our religion, does it worry you that there are many people that don't know how to calculate zakat, don't know how to distribute it properly? Does that surprise you in terms of over the number of years you've been involved?
Yeah, I suppose it doesn't surprise me anymore, but certainly in the early part of our journey, we definitely discovered this issue of the fact that there's a huge amount of misunderstanding, misinformation, a lot of myths really that surround the topic of zakat in the Muslim community. And that's why one of the key things that we did sort of halfway through our journey, so maybe a couple of years back, was to reposition our relationship with the zakat payer such that zakat payers for us were no longer donors, but rather beneficiaries or customers, just like the zakat recipient. So just like zakat recipients have needs that we are there to fulfill, zakat payers too have needs with regards to zakat payment that they need fulfilling, which we then call the understanding or education, calculation, and the collection. So even the collection and distribution of a payer's zakat, as far as we're concerned, is a service that we're providing as a middleman between payer and recipient. But by repositioning that relationship, we have a direct and inherent concern for actually supporting Muslims everywhere, regardless of where they pay their zakat, to actually understand and calculate it properly at least.
And do you feel that are you trying to make a bit of a sort of paradigm shift in the sense that many people may see zakat as a burden that they have to do? They've got wealth, they have to calculate, they have to give it away. Do you think the relationship, the mentality should be different in terms of thinking about what does our classical history say, or our precedents?
Yeah, sure. I think the payment of zakah is about being dutiful at the end of the day. That's how I think one should look at it. And it's probably, the notion of zakah classically was probably closer to the idea of tax as opposed to the idea of charity, as we use both of those words currently. So we might not say zakah is either tax or charity today, but you might call it a charity tax or something. But there is definitely an idea of this was about, just as when one pays one's taxes properly today, one considers oneself doing one's duty and being part of your citizenship of the place in which you live. Similarly, zakat could be kind of seen in that way. That's part of this faith community. You're doing your minimum due to actually resource the faith community, with what it needs to meet its important needs, basically.
And we're going to cast you away on this desert island. So tell us about the first item that you're going to take with you.
Sure. So most of mine are sort of Quranic verses. And I was trying to I ordered mine, roughly speaking, in a way that might represent my journey so far and perhaps my future sort of direction. The first verse is a verse from Surah An-Nahl, which is chapter 16, the B, where Allah says, وَلِلَّهِ غَيْبُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا أَمْرُ السَّاعَةِ إِلَّا كَلَمْحِ الْبَصَرِ أَوْ هُوَ أَقْرَبُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. So it's actually that central phrase where, after saying that to Allah belongs all the unseen matters of the heavens and the earth, and then he says that the matter of the hour, the final hour, is like the blinking of an eye, or even closer. إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. That indeed, God is all powerful over everything. And I think it's just the reason why I chose that as a starting point, because I think it just gives a sense of perspective. When you think about from Allah's perspective, the final hour coming or being like the blink of an eye, or even closer, meaning something that we all relate to, the blinking of an eye. So it's a very universal kind of concept. But the fact that really it's like nothing, from a time perspective, and certainly for him being beyond time. And it just gives a sense of perspective for us, that whatever it is that we're going through, the ups or downs or whatever it is, I just feel whenever I've come across this verse, it kind of just, roots you, repositions you, recalibrates you, if you like.
And has faith always been an important factor? In terms of, tell us a bit about what life was like growing up.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it has been. I think, I suppose I would say that I grew up in quite a religious household, where there was, from an early age, a lot of importance placed on learning and understanding, but not just knowledge for the sake of learning, but also a lot of kind of activism. So from a young age, especially my mum encouraged me to get involved with a lot of community kind of activities. Just even little things that might seem small now, but just things like, just organising regular weekly football for kind of, brothers in the local area, which I kind of did for about 10 years, during my teenage years and what have you. And we used to do like a weekly newsletter, just an A4 double-sided newsletter we produced on Fridays. We probably did over 1,000 kind of issues over the course of a few years. And every week we would kind of go around, my mum would drive me around and sort of deposit them at various mosques, basically, for people to pick up, after Jummah.
So it wasn't something from the mosque, it was actually...
No, it was something we did at home.
At home, and then you give it...
Yeah, literally went around.
And what sort of things would you write and put in this?
It was called An-Nur, like a weekly newsletter for Muslim youth. It was just like little, snippets, a hadith, a little bit of an article here and there, and, just sayings, quotes, and just all sorts. And we used to kind of get people's contributions as well. And then later on, we just put it as a PDF and just had an email list. And we found that, it wasn't something we were particularly pushing, or, it was particularly organised, I would say. But we found actually we ended up having quite a bit of a global audience. So there's literally people from all over the world actually just heard about it somehow randomly.
Is it still going, or is it?
Unfortunately, it's not at the moment, but maybe something my own children will pick up as a legacy maybe down the line.
And so then, growing up in, I guess, this quite religious household, what were your aspirations in terms of careers and direction in life? Was that clear early on?
I think my dad had a very clear idea that finance was a good idea. He would sometimes sort of put newspaper cuttings my way about how bankers and financiers generally were doing pretty well in life. So I think he definitely had that. At the same time, both my parents were kind of quite conscious of this, what we might use, or the kind of phrase that we often use, this kind of deen and dunya balance, basically. And so I was kind of, alhamdulillah, I was getting, a very good kind of quote-unquote worldly education, as well as doing all things like Arabic and, Quranic studies and what have you from quite a young age as well. I think in terms of my own ambitions, I don't know. I think even at university, even when I was at university, I was kind of really struggling with it, because actually my passion was to kind of pursue sort of Islamic studies in a kind of more traditional kind of sense. But I felt also a bit duty-bound to kind of get on and start working and relieve my kind of, my dad of his kind of burdens, if you like. And
was he involved in finance, or what was his passion?
Oh, he had a number of different. He was an engineer by profession, but then was involved in a number of different businesses and had a lot of ups and downs and all sorts. So, yeah, a very kind of varied, but very energetic man, mashallah. And he's still going, alhamdulillah. He's in his late 70s now, but he's doing well, alhamdulillah.
And so then you went to university and you studied finance?
I did economics, and then I switched for a management course for the final year at Cambridge University, so between 2002 and 2005.
And what were your university days like?
It was good, alhamdulillah, quite overtaken by Islamic society activity from an early stage. So I think within 2 months of being at the university my first year, the treasurer of the ISOC basically dropped out. And the only qualification you needed to be a treasurer of the ISOC at that time was studying economics. Like, for some reason, that was apparently, there was a connection. I was very quickly involved. And in my second year, I was vice president. In my final year, I was the president of Islamic Society. So that was always quite a big part of, my life there. I was also playing squash as well for my college squash team. But to be honest, between that and studies, probably wasn't much else I was doing really. So in one way, when I look back, I kind of think to a certain degree, I didn't necessarily fully benefit from the breadth of what was on offer at university, perhaps. But yeah, that was my.
This was at Cambridge?
Yeah.
It's often you hear about quite quite vibrant Islamic scene in these sort of universities. Did you find that it was
definitely
spoilt for choice?
No, alhamdulillah, I think it was a very vibrant scene. And it was one that was, in my time anyway, very non-sectarian. Well, when I was there, I understood that in previous sort of years, because obviously the flavour can change very quickly of kind of what's going on there. But in previous years, like in the previous, say, 5-10 years, it gone through various phases of having a certain type of identity or label. And in subsequent years, I think that was also the case to a certain degree. In my time, alhamdulillah, it was, nothing to do with me necessarily, but it was just, I just felt it was very open. Yeah, it was very non-sectarian. And I think one of the things I've never personally belonged to any group, sect or anything like that. I've always been quite open, quite happy to say I'm Muslim, and I don't need to define myself beyond that. And I think that as a principle is something which I think a lot of us are still working out, to be honest.
So tell us about your next item that you've chosen.
Well, the next one is very simple. It's just a verse of 3 words. Chapter 81, At-Takwir, verse number 26. Allah says, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ? So where are you going? And this, I think, is something. I think I'm someone who kind of, has long obsessed and probably still do obsess, probably to maybe a slightly unhealthy level, about why am I doing what I'm doing, where's it taking me, and trying to keep recalibrating and adjusting like my direction and where I'm at. I think this is a very powerful verse, very simple, but it applies again to anyone, anywhere. All human beings ask themselves that questions at different stages in their life, maybe with different frequencies, different levels of intensity, but everyone ultimately is considering this issue, so where are you going? And then the following verse, Allah says, referring to the Quran, that it is but a reminder to everybody, to all the world, meaning, almost find your sense of purpose and direction within this.
And this sense of constantly checking yourself, really being sure, it sounds like internally you need to be sure you're heading in the right direction. Has that been throughout most of your life? Is that sort of, do you remember at school, was it again, were you thinking life, meaning, purpose, all of these things?
Maybe more in a general sense, but then I think what it is, it kind of comes down to, it's not then just about so there's a certain level at which people are kind of questioning or thinking about more existential questions. But once you're settled on the idea of, God, creator, man here for a purpose, then it comes down to the micro questions, but within the same framework. And the question ultimately is, what does God want from me specifically, beyond just general notions of, yes, worship and devotion, but given the skills that I have, given the time and place that I'm in, why has he put me here now, and for me to think, well, what's the best I can do with all of that, given the exact conditions that are surrounding me. And I think that it was that kind of that line of questioning that really made me leave my sort of career that I was involved with after I left university.
So tell us a bit about that. So what did you do after university?
Yeah, so for 5 years I was basically an equity analyst, which basically means a stockbroker in the city, so working in investment banks. I was actually at probably one of the most famous investment banks, but for all the wrong reasons, which was Lehman Brothers. And so I was there for the 2.5 years before the financial kind of crisis.
It wasn't your fault, was it?
No, well, I was a victim. I think bankers get a bad rap, I think.
So give us what was that? We watch movies and Wall Street and that. I mean, what's life actually like in that
definitely hectic, intense. But I think certainly where I was at and the people that I was working with, I felt was very kind of meritocratic. So a really good learning environment, I felt. For the first 2.5 years, 3 years of my kind of 5-year stint there, I felt like I learned a lot. And I think I actually benefit from a lot of that learning even today in terms of what I do at National Zakat Foundation.
Was there a lot of pressure? Was it long hours?
Yeah, it was pressure. It was long hours. It was 6:45 starts in the office. Usually until sort of 6, 7 at night. So I was more involved on the market side, financial market side, where you typically have early starts and then early evening kind of finishes usually. But sometimes obviously it would go on, and sometimes weekends and stuff. But it wasn't kind of crazy kind of banking hours, which often happens on the deal side of banking. But I think, alhamdulillah, overall fine. And I think, again, in terms of Muslim community within the city, and certainly now I know there's a very healthy kind of Muslim professional scene, I would say, where, again, people are in this kind of deen and dunya kind of conundrum in quite an intense way. Actually, my next verse relates to this issue. So
what's your next item?
Bring that in, which is in Surah An-Nur. So just a couple of verses after the verse of light, where Allah says He's the light of the heavens and the earth. It refers to people, رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَإِقَامِ الصَّلَاةِ وَإِيتَاءِ الزَّكَاةِ. That people whom neither trade nor buying and selling business diverts them from the remembrance of Allah, establishing prayer and giving zakah. يَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا تَتَقَلَّبُ فِيهِ الْقُلُوبُ وَالْأَبْصَارُ, because they fear a day in which the hearts and sights of people will be overturned. And then Allah says that He will reward them according to the best of what they did, and that He will give them increase out of His bounty, and that He provides without sort of measure. And I've always loved this one, and I remember quoting it a lot during kind of various sermons I might have given, during those kind of city years, or sometimes when I revisit some of these places, because it's very interesting verse in terms of how it's ordered, if you like, saying that look, these are people who are involved in the world, but they're not of the world. That they are in trade and they are in business, the things that are possibly we might see as the most worldly enterprises and the most distracting. And anyone who knows is an entrepreneur or is a business person knows all about that. But none of that takes them away from the fundamentals. And he mentions specifically remembrance of God, establishing prayer, and giving the zakat. And later on, actually, we'll come to it later perhaps, but there's something really central and important, and something I've been reflecting on more in the last few years, given what I'm doing, about this whole idea of belief, salah, and zakah as really the crux of the matter when it comes to an individual but also communal development of a Muslim community.
And did you ever find that there was a conflict between, I guess, on the one side there's quite religious consciousness that you had and about faith, and I guess working in this very sort of materialistic environment, and I guess links to the quote that you just chose, but I guess some people can find that balance quite incongruous and quite difficult. Was that an internal struggle for you?
Definitely.
Was it a constant thing? Because I guess as the layman thinking about interest-based systems, etc.,
sure,
global effects.
Definitely. Initially, it's not even about that. So even before you look at the overall paradigm, if you like, in which these things are operating, just the environment is so different. Like if you just had a relatively normal upbringing, you've gone to university, you had in some, I wouldn't say, I don't know about insular, but certainly, you've let's call it kept to the straight and narrow, if you like. And then you're suddenly in this very fast-paced, clearly profit-oriented kind of environment. It's a shock. So initially for me, there was definitely an adjustment period. And when I would do internships and stuff, or some of these like 1 week or 1 day type experience things whilst at university, it was a massive shock, to be honest. I think over time you just kind of locate yourself. But I think these shocks are really important, because they, people often ask or have had conversations, maybe still do sometimes, about, do they see themselves staying in this country, raising their children here, or should they go somewhere else? Is it safer, quote unquote, elsewhere? That's a big thing that still kind of comes to people's minds. But I think it's only through the challenge of being in an environment like the one we're in, where you actually are forced to ask yourself the certain questions that really mold and shape a kind of faith that perhaps is potentially much more rooted and stronger, because you've kind of weathered a lot of these different challenges, and you can try to get to a point of seeing things how they are and get a good sense of perspective. So I think that over time, I think you definitely locate yourself, an issue of just constantly trying to calibrate and make sure that you are as best as possible on the straight path.
Tell us about your next item.
So the next one kind of refers to when I suppose one that occurs to me when I left banking, because I gave up. In financial terms, kind of gave up a lot. I actually had at the time of leaving, I was actually had just moved to another firm and had a kind of 2-year guarantee ahead of me in terms of my salary, bonus, and all these kinds of things. And so to give that up to pursue, actually at that time, something which I wasn't sure that I was going into National Zakat Foundation specifically, but I was joining an organisation called Nasim at the time, who founded National Zakat Foundation. That's how I got involved later on. And all I really knew is that they might be able to pay me kind of 4 months down the line, if this volunteering period went okay. And that there was but they had a good ethos about them, and there was a desire to be professional in doing kind of Islamic/community work. That's pretty much all I knew, really. But that was enough for me, because I was so desperate to get out of what I reached a point where I was pretty desperate to get out. I just felt I didn't have a problem with the specific line of work that I was in, from a technical sort of legal perspective. I just felt, in response to what we were speaking about earlier, that this is not why I'm on the planet, basically, like me specifically.
You couldn't see yourself there in 20 years' time?
Yeah, forget 20 years, like 20 minutes was by the end of it, it was literally like that.
It must have been quite lucrative and
exactly, it was very lucrative. I'm not quote the numbers right now, but it was not bad. So it wasn't a judgment on anyone else for doing that. It was about saying, no, this is not me. Like, given everything I have, everything I know, everything I could achieve, what does Allah want me to do? And I remember that when in that struggle, because I got quite desperate, because when you look around, there are not many obvious opportunities that are just waiting in the community for you to just walk into. Our institutional capacity is quite immature still, I would say, to allow for that, for anyone with a professional background who just wants a basic kind of wage or whatever, just to keep things going, who then just employ their skills in a more full-time capacity. There's a lot of volunteering, a lot of that stuff, which is fine. But I do feel that we need more of that, where people are actually dedicating themselves to, intra-community kind of, and even inter-community, on behalf of Muslims, activity. And I remember, I really broke down one night, to be honest, and I really felt, after maybe relying on everyone else, that I maybe was actually asking Allah directly. And I asked Allah, just to give me, a way out. And this verse, very famous verse, وَمَنْ يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا. So it appears in the Surah of Talaq, of divorce. And it's interesting because obviously divorce, for anyone who may go through it, is obviously an extremely stressful kind of situation. But here Allah says that whoever's truly conscious of God, that He will give him a way out, a makhraj. So when you go in the Arab world, above the door, instead of exit, you will see the word makhraj, right? So it's like, okay, in that time of crisis, He will point you where the exit is, basically. وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبْ, and will provide for them from where they don't expect. And I can definitely say that in the last 5 years, I have experienced that for sure. Like, when things have seemed difficult, or, even financially, or however, that things just, alhamdulillah, I feel I've experienced like mini miracles, if you like, on a fairly regular basis.
Can you share any of them?
A lot. Sometimes it does come down to issues of like provision and stuff, right? So where you don't expect. One thing I felt, when I was thinking about, okay, for me to basically give up the kind of salary and financial kind of the income that I had for something else, one of the things I remember specifically thinking was, I'm definitely not going to be able to travel as much as I used to, because I just won't be able to afford it, to be honest. So that's an item I will have to cut out. So I was kind of just working in my mind, like, what are the things that I need to be prepared for, if you like.
And you'd previously quite enjoyed traveling and done quite a bit.
Yeah, no, exactly, because obviously, I could afford to go to like nice places and nice hotels in nice countries and explore this and that and the other, which did a fair bit of, and something which obviously naturally one enjoys, right? And not to mention Umrah as well, right? And all of that kind of stuff. Just to be, these things are things that require a bit of cash nowadays, Hajj, etc. But subhanallah, last year, for example, I went to 8 countries. 8 different countries, and none of them which I was particularly pursuing. Just opportunities came up and things happened, but it was just either part of the work I was doing or some other opportunity that came up. But just things happened, and and a lot of those visits didn't happen with me necessarily putting much money on the table, right? So alhamdulillah, I think that's a simple example, but it's just one of those things which I think that we talk about the issue of provision being fixed, but I think for a lot of people that's a very theoretical notion. Like, do we actually have the guts to kind of go make decisions knowing that is actually the case?
So that's what I was going to ask, because I guess we often hear sermons and lectures about, I guess, having that true yaqeen, trust in Allah, but literally, you're probably like jumping off a cliff and not knowing what's going to happen, because when you left, it was a voluntary job, was it some other job, career, all of those things, but you've found over the years that things have come through, and even in a better position than you could have ever imagined.
Another even more obvious one, to be honest, which I didn't mention, is that when I left, I wasn't married at the time, and I just so happened to end up in. So I left in June 2011, and Ramadan was in August, and I had agreed to basically start sort of working, if you like, with Mercy Mission immediately after Ramadan. And in the meantime, Mercy Mission set up had just launched what they called a Medina, or an Islamic centre in Melbourne, in Australia. And that year, like in the previous 2 years, I had actually been involved in doing Tarawih at my local masjid. But that particular year, like I think a new imam had come in, and basically there wasn't, it wasn't necessary. My services weren't required.
Very diplomatic.
Yes. And I remember being a little bit peeved about that at the time. But anyway, then this thing came up, and then the guys in Australia had said that they wanted to launch like a mid-Ramadan program, basically, right, in Melbourne. So I said, okay, well, I'll go then, basically, right? Maybe I can just go and help out. It was just very spontaneous. And on the 29th night of Ramadan, I met my now wife.
Really?
Yeah. So that was around the end of August, and I literally met her. Apparently she was dragged kicking and screaming, on the encouragement of a friend who was the wife of a guy that I got to know there, to say, like, you can meet this guy, maybe it might be something there. And so it was quite time constrained. People were thinking, like, well, why the heck were you doing this on the 29th night of Ramadan? Because basically, I think apparently the next day she was going off, and a couple of days later I was leaving and stuff. So she was going to Sydney from Melbourne and stuff. Anyway, so I met her for about just over an hour or so on that night. And so it was definitely the night of power. And then
there's a lot of Nur and light.
And then a month later, so I came back 2 or 3 days later to the UK, and then a month later I went back to do the nikah there. And then a couple of months later, she moved to the UK. Alhamdulillah, we're still married. We've got 2 girls now.
Alhamdulillah.
So that I mean, yeah, she'll probably, if she listens to this, thinking like, why did you mention that after you mentioned this holiday and traveling thing? But yeah, anyway,
tell us about your next item.
Sure. So the next one also relates a little bit to what we spoke about earlier. And in Surah Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, I think, summarizes the importance of cooperation, but also about, like, again, priority matters. We talked about the first 3 pillars, or iman, belief, salah and zakah. So he says, وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتُ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. He said, the believing men and women are friends, supporters, protectors of each other. And then describes what they do, He says, يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. They encourage, enjoying the good, forbid the evil, and things which are, wrong and inappropriate. وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ. They establish prayer, they give zakah. وَيُطِيعُونَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ. And they obey Allah and His Messenger. So it's interesting that, again, this issue of salah and zakah comes up. So actually, salah and zakah are mentioned together about 28 times in the Quran. And in this particular one, every time they're mentioned, you could argue they didn't have to be mentioned, because obviously salah and zakah come within obedience, within enjoining the good, and all of that. But they're always highlighted very specifically as being important. It's almost like the prime act of duty and devotion to Allah, and the prime act of dutifulness on a communal sense. These 2 vertical and horizontal, if you like, dimensions come together, and both involve the minimum sacrifice of time and money. Arguably our 2 most pressing. Nowadays you say time is money, right? But a minimum sacrifice of time in salah and money in wealth in zakah that Allah requires from us, almost as like necessary conditions to evidence the first pillar, this bearing witness that He is one. There's nothing else worthy of devotion. So Allah describes them like this, and He says, أُولَٰئِكَ يَسْتَرْحَمُهُمُ اللَّهُ. These are the ones that Allah will shower His mercy upon. Indeed, Allah is Almighty wise. So I think for me that's been an important one, because actually that's this enjoining the good, and the whole idea of being involved in this zakah institution, if you like, is something being quite obviously deeply now involved in for the last 5.5 years or so. So yeah, that was just the one I wanted to share.
And so when you joined Mercy Mission, where did the National Zakat Foundation come out of that? Were you involved from the early stages, and was that what were you doing in those early days?
Sure. So basically that same Ramadan when I was off in Australia, that was the Ramadan that National Zakat Foundation was being launched here. So I wasn't involved in that launch kind of activities as such. But then about a few months later, towards the end of 2011, effectively there was a bit of a vacuum in terms of who was really going to take this on now, post what was an initially successful fundraising and awareness period. So I basically became the first full-time staff member of NZF, which at that time was a part of the entity of Mercy Mission. And then a couple of years later, it spun out of Mercy Mission to a separate entity and charity. And now, alhamdulillah, we have over 20 staff around the country. We've opened the UK's first Zakat Centre in Whitechapel, in which we're sitting right now. Alhamdulillah, we've also got plans. At the moment, we're looking at opening a Zakat Centre in Birmingham and Leicester as well. And slowly, hopefully, going to move our way up towards Glasgow.
I was going to ask you, any presence in Scotland?
Yeah, something I've long spoken to about. Probably some mutual friends I've spoken to on this issue as well. I think we're getting there slowly, but maybe a little bit too slowly. Half the time we're wondering whether you guys are still going to be part of the UK or not, you see. So since you guys can never make up your mind, or circumstances conspire to give you further opportunities to separate yourselves, it's almost like from a strategic standpoint, we almost want to kind of just wait, are you still part of this country or not? So anyway, that's a side point. But we do have presence from the perspective of there are zakat payers and recipients in Scotland that we engage with. So any person who's in difficulty in Scotland can apply to us or be referred to us for support, because the vast majority of our zakat distribution is done remotely, as is the vast majority of our advice and support for zakat payers. So any zakat payer in Scotland who wants just to ask a question about zakat calculation, just to understand something, wants to give their zakat locally to be distributed within the UK and possibly even within Scotland, because we do have recipients in Scotland, we can service. So in a remote sense, we can service, if you like, the Scottish Muslim population, but certainly it's something we'd like to definitely advance soon in terms of a more physical and local presence.
Because I think you've advertised previously on things like Radio Ramadan in Glasgow and stuff.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, for people that are not familiar with the model, in terms of you talk about recipients in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the setup you've got? How can you help?
Sure.
How can we help use zakat in the UK?
Yeah, sure. So number one is that what for anybody who's got kind of who's uncertain about the whole issue of zakat being given locally in the first place, or whether there's anybody who's eligible. I mean, we've dealt with now 5,500 cases, since we've been around, and pretty much dealing with 400 new ones a month now. So that matter for us is pretty much settled. As far as is there the need, and to be honest, even the mainstream press over the last 5 years during austerity and food banks being on the rise all over the country, and I think probably on average the Scottish seem to understand this issue probably more than some parts of the rest of the UK, and know that there is an issue of poverty, and need in this country, and within our community it's disproportionately higher than the average. So there is an even bigger issue. So what we do is basically we provide in effect a grant, very flexible, tailored grant service for an individual in difficulty. So someone can apply to us, will be referred to us. There'll be an administrative process just to make sure we have all the details. We have an expert caseworker with various supporting sort of specialists who can then identify what the particular issues are and provide holistic advice and support, as well as direct zakat money in such a way that will really support that person with their essentials, but also increasing over the last few years with more, if you like, empowerment related needs, even educational. So now, we have a balance of spend now across our whole zakat distribution that is dealing with the sharp end of poverty on a day-to-day basis and emergencies and street homelessness, but it's also on the other hand helping Muslims complete master's programs and PhDs, or entering into vocational training, or fulfilling other kinds of needs, which is about also supporting our, if you like, perhaps existing or emerging, leadership. And sometimes that strikes people as odd. Why? Because in their minds, zakat is only about poverty. But there's a strong argument to say that, zakat is not ultimately about poverty. Just like salah ultimately is not about physical exercise, or fasting is not ultimately about just, not eating or drinking, and hajj is not ultimately about just going there and putting the 2 sheets on and all the rest of it. All of these pillars are there ultimately to build, maintain, and protect the processes and the characteristics in the individuals and in the community that will give the best chance for faith to flourish. So zakat ultimately is about putting the necessary conditions in place, the socio-economic conditions in place, such that iman's got a good chance. And how do we know this? Because even with the poverty issue, why do we give to the poor? Ultimately, we give to the poor so they don't give up on this faith community. That's why in certain parts of the world, and even in this country, where when poor Muslims don't find support from within the Muslim community, but they find that support elsewhere, well, what does that do for their Islam, for their iman? Whereas we know through a lot of the experience that we've had is that once that support has been provided, to which they have a right, that their response and their feedback is not about the material benefit that they receive, but about the fact that, oh brother, I believe in Allah again, I feel part of the Muslim community again. Just being able to speak to someone from their own community is such a massive iman boosting kind of belonging kind of effect that we often just forget about or disregard.
And does that often reaffirm to you that you made the right choices?
No, alhamdulillah, no, definitely. I mean, no regrets whatsoever. Obviously, there's been challenges and difficulties, but then again, you seem to have this ability to just take me from one verse to the next. So my next one is from Surah Ali Imran, chapter 3, verse 139, where Allah says, وَلَا تَهِنُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. When things are difficult, which they have been obviously, sometimes very difficult at times, from all sort of different perspectives, Allah says, don't fear, don't grieve, almost like don't give up kind of thing. You will be in the ascendancy if you're truly believers. Yeah, that basically, yes, you will have your ups and downs, but just like a stock price chart, right, we'll have its ups and downs. But as long as its trajectory is up in the long run, that's the guarantee that Allah gives us. Basically, if you truly demonstrate that iman and replenish it and kind of really strive, then inshallah things will work out.
And have you faced a lot of resistance or challenges with the NZF?
There have been some. I think at the end of the day, not much that has been that vocal. Certainly in the beginning there were challenges. The guys who even were launching the NZF before I was really fully involved, they faced a lot of challenge and difficulty. Anything new causes sort of a bit of an upheaval, if you like. But on balance, the vast majority of people that, as far as I can tell, I think understand the sense. So even if they're not actively people aren't actively willing to give their zakah locally for whatever reason, Sometimes it could be a good reason. They might have like family, abroad that need support and what have you. That I think the vast majority of people don't have a problem with the concept or in principle. And I think it's impossible to have a problem with it in principle. This is the thing. But I think where a shift still needs to take place is actually, which is something which again for most people might seem quite an extreme kind of position, but it's one that I'm kind of quite convinced about now. I've thought about it day in, day out for a long time. And trying to take myself outside of my position, but just looking at it, if you like, strategically, is that local zakat, I believe, is a priority. And the reason it's a priority is because, as I said, it goes beyond the poverty thing. It's about making our community strong. And if our community is strong, and that strength is of many different kind of types, if you like, but if our community is strong, actually, this small, relatively small, even UK Muslim community can have a much bigger global impact. Prevent a lot of global problems and difficulties, and have a much bigger reach and influence. If we have a certain strength, which I do think that zakat is a big part of locally.
And I guess one of the things that you're challenging is the culture of sending zakat abroad into other countries and back home for many of us. What do you say to people that say, look, you talk about poverty here and fine, but it's not to the extent of real poverty up across. At least there's a welfare system. There's other issues here.
Yes.
So in terms of where you're going to get the most impact for the pound that you're going to give to zakat.
Yeah.
We still feel more comfortable giving it abroad.
That's fine, but then this is the point. Who said that that's the way to assess where your zakat should go? Where does it say that we are supposed to assess where we give our zakat on the basis of where we feel that it will have most impact as zakat payers? This is the problem. We are actually look at zakat in what I would consider to be highly secular, humanitarian / philanthropic.
Is it not a case of where the greatest need is?
No. That is a factor. If you look and take the whole global kind of position, that is a factor. But again, remember, it's not poverty. Is not. If you think it's about poverty in the end, then you can see it in that way. But if you see it in the framework I've been trying to suggest, then actually it's relative. Because look, if there is a young Muslim for whom that support or not support, in Glasgow, in London, or anywhere in between. If there is a young Muslim for whom that support might be the difference between their iman or not iman, then who is to say that person is not more in need than someone elsewhere? And this is the problem. We've become very material. Why do we assess zakat in purely material terms or its impact? Now, if you look at it, that actually, yes, okay, it does make sense that the ultimate desire, as far as Allah is concerned, His want or not is not a material one at the end of the day. His ultimate concern is, where are our hearts going, right? And are we devoted to Him? And therefore making it a duty that we put that minimum provision in, so that people aren't falling to a level of desperation that might call with the community in question, ultimately call him into question. The Prophet ﷺ used to make a dua, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-kufri wal-faqr. I seek refuge in you from disbelief and poverty. It's not a coincidence those two came together, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, I think that, who are we to judge them? And then it comes down to duty, because the other way to look at this is to say, well, where there is a recipient in London or in Glasgow or again anywhere in between, but let's say on the streets around me, that's my problem. And whatever I do anywhere else around the world, that person is still my problem. So it's like the issue of I would compare it to the issue of the obligation to bury somebody when they pass away. We talk about it as a communal obligation. Until that person is buried, we've all got a problem. Well, until there's zakat recipients in the UK, it doesn't matter what else we do. We can still give money to go, for example, to bury people elsewhere in that initial example, but this person still needs burying. So we've still got we've still got an accountability. So if you look at it from the point of view of duty and accountability and responsibility, this issue doesn't go in. And finally, I would say this, is that I still believe that there's a much stronger argument, a long-run argument to say that we are far less likely to be in a position where our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still giving relentlessly to what seems oftentimes, unfortunately, to be a black hole in whichever country around the world where there's this crisis or that crisis. We're less likely to be doing that in 100 years' time if we build strength here. Whereas if we just keep doing what we're doing, which is oftentimes, unfortunately, like putting a plaster on like a gushing wound, what's it ultimately really achieving other than assuaging our own consciences temporarily? That's the problem. And so it's tough, of course, this is a highly emotive issue, but then remember sadaqah as well. So there is an idea that zakah for local and then sadaqah for elsewhere, or at least splitting one zakah if one still can't get through that, that issue, for example. or at least a portion of one's zakah coming locally. If one can't see it, that, okay, this is the priority and my sadaqah and other giving can go elsewhere, well, at least you can balance and apportion things.
Tell us about your next item.
The penultimate one is a hadith actually about, it's in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, a famous one but a beautiful one, where the Prophet ﷺ said that if the hour falls upon you whilst in your hand is a sapling, then let that person plant it, basically. Then you should plant it. It's quite amazing, an amazing hadith, really, if you think about it, about a kind of a can-do attitude, kind of keep going right to the very last. If the hours will fall upon you, what does that mean? It means like the whole earth is shaking around you. إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا, and all of these things that the sky falling, stars extinguishing. But you've got this, just still plant it. It's amazing, really. So, like, when all the chips are down, basically, and everything looks like it's maybe looking like a bit of a disaster, it's like just opportunistic. Just be, I think it's not a word that maybe is bandied around too much, but the idea of Muslims being like ridiculous opportunists for goodness, like that's what I take from that anyway. That any little thing here or there, who knows what small deed can be, weigh heavily with Allah because of its intention, right? And it's just about constantly just looking, being alert to, right, what can I do? What can I do here that will please Allah, or in that situation, or this situation? It can be something very small. But it can be so weighty with him.
And are you an optimist?
An optimist? Yeah, I think if we have to be. The Prophet ﷺ was an optimist, and I think it's important to be a realist as well as an optimist. But pessimism is not our way.
And where would you like to see yourself in 5-10 years time, or with the NZF? Where would you like things to go?
I've tried in a way to almost. As far as the National Zakat Foundation is concerned, I suppose it's different. If you're asking me what I want myself to be, that's probably a different question to where I want NZF to be.
Well, you tell me about yourself.
Because I've tried to separate myself from being completely part of the furniture here, as far as possible. As far as just very briefly, as far as the NZF is concerned, like, I think I've actually given up on quantitative ambitions. I'd like it to be this big by this point in time. I actually think it's quite a dangerous way to look at things. Almost like if everyone's running their business, for example, and I want it to be this big or this profitable or this whatever. And to be honest, a lot of charities work like this. I have a target of a certain fundraising amount in a certain period of time. And I think to a certain extent one can understand where that comes from, but I think it can be quite damaging to the culture and like how things work. Money becomes the object, basically. A number becomes the focus. Whereas if quality is the focus, the quality of activity on a day-to-day basis, in our case, a quality of service, I believe that if we truly serve zakat payers with a genuine desire for people to understand, calculate, and pay zakat properly, and do it, for the right reasons, really understand what this pillar is about, and genuinely go out to serve recipients and simply inform people about what we're doing, that is enough. We actually don't have a fundraising department, actually. We're just a marketing department that tells people, well, here are these services, here are those services, this is what we do. We don't really do the kind of fundraising dinners where we're kind of haranguing people for this, that, and the other, because I just don't feel that's appropriate. I think it actually takes away the dignity of the process, and I'm not sure that it's what is intended, especially when it comes to zakat, at least. So I think that for me, it's that quality over quantity, and I think the quantity becomes a consequence, but not a target. So inshallah, I'm confident that will happen. As far as myself is concerned, then I think I just want to be in a position where, whether it's in NZF or beyond NZF, where I'm just able to have as much of an impact as possible as especially supporting other people's journeys. I've had various influences, but I wouldn't say I've had a mentor. I haven't been able to locate one, to be honest. I think I'm probably fairly well networked, but just somebody I feel I can really just trust, who I feel's got the relevant experience, like real world experience, rooted Islamically. And so I have various inputs which I then kind of gather and take different influences. I wouldn't say I've had that kind of really one-stop shop type mentor. And not necessarily it's not that it's necessary, because I think drawing a lot of different influences is a good thing. But I'd like to be someone who can really support people, especially, quote unquote, emerging sort of leadership. And this idea of leadership is an interesting one. I'm very interested in actually exploring this notion, possibly even academically, like more. What does faith leadership mean? In the Quran, we ask Allah, وَجَعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. There's a dua, that we ask God to make us leaders for the muttaqeen, right? For those who are God conscious. What does that actually mean? What are you actually asking for, precisely? That's a very interesting thing for me, and I think that it's something which I think, again, it's probably been underdeveloped kind of, notion. So, yeah.
And take us to your final item that you're going to take with you to the
island. The final item has to be is what I'd call the words that you want to hear at the very end. So at the end of Surah Al-Fajr, famous set of verses, which often are, sometimes you find when you go to a graveyard inscribed on some gravestones and stuff, where the soul of the person is addressed, right, at the time of death. يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. And basically, this is like what we all want to really hear at the end, right? That, oh, you contented soul, return to your Lord, pleased with Him and Him being pleased with you. So enter amongst my servants and enter my garden. And that's how Surah Al-Fajr, ends. Yeah, and that's really what it's all about, I suppose. Trying to find that contentment. And as I think, Ibn Taymiyyah said that, there is a Jannah in this world, and whoever doesn't find it may not find it in the next life, right? Something, that's a paraphrasing, but something along those lines. But it is about finding that kind of, nurturing that internal garden before, inshallah, we end up in the garden of the hereafter.
Sure. And you strike me as somebody who's obviously very intelligent, very sort of competent, always a doer, a problem solver. I get the sense that your mind's always ticking and thinking about ideas. Do you have time to relax? What do you do to relax? Do you have anything that makes you laugh?
Yeah, no, I like comedy in general. I'm not sure if my own comedy is any good, but I think I find a lot of it depends. Like a lot of this work is in itself very pleasurable. The people you get to meet, the discussions that you have, the relationships that you build. I built relationships, alhamdulillah, with people that are just so valuable. So, and you find a lot of pleasure in that. So with those same people that you're sort of working hard with, that sort of day in, day out, or communicating with, actually you are able just to have that social time with them. Obviously, family-wise, trying to balance everything is obviously very difficult. With spending time with parents, wife, 2 girls, as I mentioned, they're very young, 2 and 3, so they're kind of automatic de-stressors, really. But alhamdulillah, yeah, I try and balance things out. But I don't think there's not a lot that I can point to that I actually do, other than the work that I'm doing. I like reading because I think that it just gets you. I like reading, and then basically, looking at the theory of whatever you're looking at, and then just looking at what you're actually doing and trying to find some sort of harmony.
So how do you think you'll cope with the solitude on this desert island?
Actually, it's so funny because I often tell my wife that I'm someone who actually craves solitude. I actually hate being in the limelight, to be honest, to the small extent that I might be sometimes. I actually quite dislike it. I don't like, inherently managing people, actually having that responsibility. I find it actually very stressful, in its own right. So I love the idea of solitude, to be honest. So hopefully someone will rescue me from the island, within some period of time. But I do like it. I think a sense of quiet and peace, is something which is quite difficult to come by. So yeah, I think
you'll do okay.
I'll do all right, at least at the beginning, before I start missing people. But yeah.
And you can take a book with you. What book would you take with you apart from obviously the Quran?
So the book I put down is called King of the Castle by Guy Eaton. So Guy Eaton passed away a few years ago, a quite remarkable kind of person, and his writings, some of the most amazing kind of writings about Islam in the English language. Islam, and also Islam and modernity specifically. So he has 2 books, Islam and the Destiny of Man, which many people have converted on just reading that book. And this King of the Castle is a book that I read. So when we were talking about this whole reconciling, being in kind of the finance world, and and trying to be religious and having that kind of lifestyle, this is one that kind of really helped me. Actually, I remember reading on the train back and forth from work at that time, and it was something that really helped me kind of place myself. And it was about putting, because a lot of people, they don't maybe think about just putting the modern world in context, of human sort of history. And there's a lot of features of modernity or post-modernity, as people kind of would talk about it now, that are quite particular in a sort of historical sense. And there's it gives rise to a lot of confusion, difficulty, and people kind of questioning things and seeing where they are. So I found it a brilliant book, to be honest. I thoroughly recommend it. So it's King of the Castle, and the subtitle is A Choice and Responsibility in the Modern World.
And you can take a luxury item with you.
Yeah. So it's interesting. The only thing I could really think of is as a luxury item. I don't really possess many luxury items, to be honest. But I think I could only mention my phone, not because I could call anyone necessarily, because presumably there's no reception on this desert island, but just because on my Kindle on my phone I've got a lot of books, so I could just maybe access more books that way. But yeah, I couldn't really think of anything else.
Jazakallah khair. So it's been fascinating, Iqbal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
May Allah continue to bless the work that you do, give you strength, inshallah. And I think clearly you're changing lives through the NZF, and inshallah that is something that hopefully that'll continue to grow and people will benefit from. So Jazakallah khair for your time. Remember us in your du'as.
Likewise, thank you.
And please keep in touch and keep us updated, I guess, with what's happening in Scotland as well.
Absolutely. Well, whenever you want to get me back on Radio Ramadan in Glasgow, let me know.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for listening to Desert Island Gems. Let us know what you think of the show on the Radio Ramadan Facebook page, and keep an eye out for special versions of the show on McMuslim.tv.